Jean-Claude Van Damme's 1994 time travel action flick wasn't just about splits and roundhouse kicks through history. Behind the scenes, this sci-fi spectacle hid bizarre production secrets, mind-bending mistakes, and oddball trivia that would make even time travelers scratch their heads. From Van Damme's dangerous kitchen stunts to melting villains and failed future predictions, this movie was stranger than fiction. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about Timecop, 1994. Fact 1. Kitchen counter split was real death, defying stunt. When Jean-Claude Van Damme leaps onto his kitchen counter and performs a perfect split between two cabinets to avoid electrocuted water, the audiences worldwide assumed they were watching movie magic created with computer effects or clever camera tricks. The reality behind this iconic scene from Timecop is far more impressive and dangerous than anyone imagined at the time. Van Damme actually performed this stunt himself, without the aid of CGI or even safety wires, making it one of the most genuinely death-defying moments in his entire career. The scene required the Belgian martial artist to jump up from the kitchen floor in a single fluid motion, land perfectly on the narrow edges of two kitchen cabinets, and execute his signature split while maintaining perfect balance. The stunt was made even more perilous by the presence of real electrical equipment and water on the floor below, creating an authentic electrocution hazard that added genuine stakes to the performance. What makes this moment particularly remarkable is that Van Damme had to nail the timing perfectly in just a few takes, since the elaborate kitchen set and electrical effects were expensive to reset between attempts. The actor's years of martial arts training and flexibility work paid off during this sequence, as even the slightest miscalculation could have resulted in serious injury from either the fall or the electrical setup below. The stunt has since become one of the most memorable and frequently referenced moments in Van Damme's filmography, often cited by fans and critics as the perfect example of the actor's commitment to performing his own dangerous stunts. The scene has been endlessly replicated in internet memes and compilation videos, with many viewers still refusing to believe that Van Damme actually performed the split without assistance. Director Peter Hyams later confirmed that the stunt was performed practically, making it a genuine testament to Van Damme's athletic abilities and willingness to put himself at risk for the sake of creating an unforgettable movie moment. Fact 2. Sony minidisc player was dead technology. One of the most embarrassing failed predictions in Timecop involves a seemingly minor prop that perfectly captures how wrong filmmakers can be about the future of technology. When Max Walker's ex-partner travels back to the 1920s, he's shown listening to what the movie presents as cutting-edge portable music technology from the early 2000s. The device in question was a Sony minidisc player, which the filmmakers confidently assumed would be the dominant personal music format by 2004. In 1994, when Timecop was being produced, Sony was heavily promoting the mini-disc as the next revolutionary step in portable audio technology. The format promised CD-quality sound in a smaller, more durable package that could record and re-record music multiple times. Sony marketed mini-disc players as the wave of the future that would eventually replace both cassette tapes and compact discs for personal listening. The Timecop production team, wanting to create an authentic vision of what technology might look like 10 years in the future, chose the mini-disc player as their futuristic prop because it seemed like the most logical evolution of portable music devices. The reality turned out to be completely different from Sony's ambitious predictions. By the actual year 2004, mini-disc players had become one of the most spectacular commercial failures in consumer electronics history. The format never gained significant popularity outside of Japan, and even there it remained a niche product used mainly by audio professionals and enthusiasts. Most consumers had never even heard of mini-disc technology, let alone owned a player. Instead of mini-discs dominating the market, the early 2000s saw the rise of MP3 players and eventually the iPod, which used completely different technology that stored music digitally without any physical discs at all. Sony officially discontinued the mini-disc format in 2013, making the Timecop prop a perfect example of how difficult it is to predict which technologies will succeed and which will end up in the dustbin of history. Fact 3. Vancouver building reflects in 1929 New York. During one of Timecop's most dramatic action sequences, where Max Walker and his corrupt former partner Atwood fall from a tall building in 1929 New York City, eagle-eyed viewers can spot one of the most glaring location mistakes in movie history. As the two characters plummet toward the street below, The reflection in the building's windows clearly shows Vancouver's distinctive Harbour Centre Tower, a modern skyscraper that creates not just one historical error, but two separate anachronisms in a single shot. The Harbour Centre is one of Vancouver's most recognizable landmarks, featuring a unique cylindrical design with a distinctive revolving restaurant at the top that makes it instantly identifiable to anyone familiar with the Canadian city's skyline. The problem for Timecop's production team was that this building wasn't completed until 1977, making its appearance in a scene supposedly set in 1929 completely impossible. Even worse, the sequence is meant to take place in New York City, not Vancouver, meaning the building shouldn't appear in the scene regardless of what year it was built. This mistake happened because Timecop was filmed entirely in Vancouver, which was a common practice for Hollywood productions in the 1990s due to favorable exchange rates and lower production costs. The filmmakers attempted to transform various Vancouver locations into convincing doubles for New York City, Washington, D.C., and other American cities throughout the movie. However, during the complex stunt sequence involving the building fall, the crew apparently didn't notice that the Harbour Centre's reflection was clearly visible in the glass windows of the building they were using as their 1929 New York location. The error becomes even more obvious when viewed on modern high-definition screens, where the Harbour Centre's distinctive architecture stands out prominently in the reflection. This mistake has become a favorite discovery among movie error enthusiasts and fans who enjoy spotting continuity problems, since it represents such a perfect example of how difficult it can be to completely disguise filming locations when working with reflective surfaces and modern urban environments. Fact 4. Carbon dating gold makes no scientific sense. Early in Timecop, when government officials are explaining how they discovered evidence of time travel, they present what should be compelling proof in the form of Confederate gold coins that were supposedly used in modern arms deals. The officials confidently state that these coins were carbon dated back to the Civil War era, which sounds impressive and scientific, until you realize that this statement represents a fundamental misunderstanding of how carbon dating actually works. Carbon dating is a scientific method that can only be used on materials that contain carbon, specifically organic matter that was once part of living organisms like wood, bone, cloth, or plant fibers. The process works by measuring the decay of carbon-14, a radioactive isotope that gets absorbed by living things while they're alive, and then begins breaking down at a predictable rate after they die. Scientists can measure how much carbon-14 remains in a sample to determine approximately when the organism died. Gold, however, is a pure chemical element made up entirely of gold atoms, with no carbon content whatsoever. Since gold was never alive and contains no organic material, it's completely impossible to carbon date gold coins, jewelry, or any other gold objects using this method. The Timecop screenwriters apparently confused carbon dating with other types of scientific analysis that can be performed on metals, or they simply used the term because it sounded official and scientific to general audiences. What makes this error even more problematic for the movie's plot is that the officials are using this supposedly carbon-dated gold as their primary evidence that time travel has occurred. In reality, there are other scientific methods that could potentially be used to analyze the age and origin of gold coins, such as examining the specific composition of trace metals or studying the manufacturing techniques used to create them. However, none of these alternative methods would be called carbon dating, and they would be much more complex and less definitive than the simple carbon dating test that the movie presents. The screenwriters essentially built a key plot point around a scientific impossibility that anyone with basic knowledge of archaeology or chemistry would immediately recognize as completely wrong. Fact 5. Comic book had completely different plot. Most fans of Timecop have no idea that the movie was based on a comic book, and even fewer realize that the original Dark Horse comic story was completely different from the film that eventually reached theaters. The comic book version, titled Timecop: A Man Out of Time, was published in 1992 as a 3-part story in the Dark Horse Comics anthology series, but it featured an entirely different plot that focused on apartheid-era South Africa, rather than corrupt American politicians. In the original comic story, Max Walker was still a Time Enforcement Commission agent, but instead of investigating a senator's political conspiracy, he was pursuing an illegal time traveler who was robbing diamond mines in 1930s South Africa. The comic featured a character named Joseph Mgbodo and dealt with themes related to racial oppression and the historical injustices of the apartheid system. The story also included a hunter-killer robot that remained in the past after the criminal was captured, creating ongoing problems for the timeline that Walker had to resolve. The movie completely abandoned these elements in favor of a more straightforward action plot centered around Senator McComb's scheme to use time travel to fund his presidential campaign. Gone were the South African setting, the diamond mine robberies, the robot, and the apartheid themes. The film also added the personal motivation of Walker's murdered wife Melissa, which didn't exist in the original comic at all. In the comic version, Walker's wife was simply implied to be dead, with no explanation of how or why she died, and certainly no suggestion that her death was connected to the main villain's plot. The filmmakers Mike Richardson and Mark Verheiden, who wrote both the comic and the movie screenplay, made these dramatic changes to create a more commercially viable action film that would work as a star vehicle for Jean-Claude Van Damme. The apartheid subplot would have been difficult to handle sensitively in a mainstream action movie, and the political conspiracy plot provided more opportunities for the kind of hand-to-hand combat and chase sequences that Van Damme's fans expected. The comic story was also quite short, spanning only 3 issues, so the screenwriters needed to develop much more material to fill a feature-length film. Fact 6. Ron Silver used stunt doubles for time meetings. One of the most technically challenging aspects of filming Timecop involved creating convincing scenes where characters from different time periods interact with each other, particularly when Senator McComb meets his younger self from 1994. To pull off these complex sequences, the production team had to use an elaborate combination of stunt doubles, careful camera work, and strategic editing that most viewers never notice while watching the movie. During the climactic fight scenes where both the older and younger versions of Max Walker appear together, the filmmakers used Jean-Claude Van Damme's regular stunt double to stand in for one version of the character while Van Damme himself played the other. This technique allowed them to show both Walkers fighting side by side against McComb's henchmen without requiring expensive special effects or complicated split-screen photography. The stunt double was carefully chosen to match Van Damme's build and fighting style, and the scenes were shot in low lighting conditions that helped disguise any differences between the real actor and his replacement. The same approach was used for Ron Silver's character Senator McComb when the older version from 2004 confronts his younger self from 1994. Silver's stunt double was brought in to play one version of McComb while Silver himself portrayed the other, allowing the filmmakers to create the illusion that both versions of the character were present in the same scene. The production team had to coordinate these sequences very carefully, since both actors needed to deliver their dialogue and perform their actions in ways that would match up convincingly when the scenes were edited together. This behind-the-scenes technique was necessary because the movie was made in 1994, before digital effects technology had advanced enough to easily create convincing scenes with the same actor playing multiple roles. Modern movies can use computer graphics to digitally duplicate actors or age them up and down, but Timecop's production team had to rely on practical filmmaking methods like stunt doubles and clever editing to achieve the same effect. The approach worked well enough that most audiences never questioned whether they were really seeing the same actors playing multiple versions of themselves. Fact 7. Van Damme's highest grossing leading role film. Despite receiving mixed reviews from critics who complained about its plot holes and cheesy dialogue, Timecop became the biggest commercial success of Jean-Claude Van Damme's career as a leading man, proving that audiences were more interested in his action sequences than critical acclaim. The film earned over $129 million worldwide during its theatrical run, making it Van Damme's most financially successful movie, where he played the main character. Timecop opened at number 1 at the American box office in September 1994, earning more than $12 million during its first weekend from over 2,000 theaters across the country. The movie maintained its top position for a second week, bringing in an additional $8 million before other films finally knocked it out of the number 1 spot. By the time its theatrical run ended, Timecop had earned $54 million in the United States and Canada, with international sales adding another $75 million to reach its impressive worldwide total. This success was particularly significant for Van Damme because it represented the peak of his mainstream Hollywood career during the 1990s. While he had appeared in other successful films like Double Impact and Universal Soldier, those movies featured him in supporting roles or as part of ensemble casts. Timecop was specifically designed as a Van Damme star vehicle, with the entire story built around showcasing his martial arts skills and signature moves like his famous splits. The financial success of Timecop led Universal Pictures to immediately offer Van Damme another collaboration with director Peter Hyams, which resulted in the 1995 film Sudden Death. However, none of Van Damme's subsequent movies ever matched the commercial performance of Timecop, making it a unique high point in his career. The film's success also helped establish the viability of comic book adaptations in Hollywood, since Timecop was one of the early examples of a Dark Horse Comics property being successfully translated to the big screen. Van Damme himself has acknowledged that Timecop remains his biggest hit, and the movie continues to be popular with action movie fans more than 30 years after its original release. Fact 8. Universal used wrong logo on trailers. In an unusual marketing mistake that highlights how complex movie studio branding can be, Universal Pictures used two completely different company logos for Timecop's promotional materials and the actual film itself. The theatrical trailers and television advertisements featured the classic 1936 Universal Pictures Art Deco globe logo, with its distinctive spinning earth design and elegant typography that had been retired from regular use decades earlier. The Art Deco globe logo was originally created during Universal's golden age of monster movies in the 1930s, and had become strongly associated with classic Hollywood films like Dracula, Frankenstein, and The Wolfman. This vintage logo featured a stylized globe surrounded by elegant Art Deco lettering that spelled out Universal Pictures in a font that perfectly captured the glamorous movie studio aesthetic of that era. By 1994, this logo was considered a nostalgic throwback that the studio occasionally used for special occasions or films that wanted to evoke a classic Hollywood feeling. However, when audiences actually went to theaters to see Timecop, they were greeted by Universal's contemporary 1991 logo, which featured a much more modern design with updated graphics and typography. This newer logo had been the studio's standard corporate identity for several years by the time Timecop was released, and it was what appeared at the beginning of the actual movie that played in theaters. The reason for this discrepancy is unclear, but it likely resulted from different departments within Universal's marketing and distribution divisions using different versions of the company logo without coordinating their choices. The marketing team responsible for creating the trailers may have chosen the vintage Art Deco logo because they felt it gave Timecop a more epic, classic movie feel that would appeal to audiences. Meanwhile, the film's actual print distribution used the standard contemporary logo that was appearing on all Universal releases during that time period. This type of branding inconsistency was more common in the pre-digital era, when different marketing materials were often created by separate teams using different resources and style guides. Fact 9. Same fight moves replayed multiple times. During one of Timecop's most intense action sequences, where Max Walker engages in hand-to-hand combat with a knife-wielding assassin in his kitchen, careful viewers can spot one of the most obvious examples of recycled footage in action movie history. The editors took a single sequence of attack and parry moves between Van Damme and his opponent and replayed it 2 to 4 times in rapid succession, apparently hoping that the fast-paced editing would prevent audiences from noticing the repetition. This cost-cutting technique becomes particularly obvious when watching the scene in slow motion or on high-definition home video releases, where the identical movements and camera angles make it clear that the same few seconds of footage are being repeated over and over again. The repeated sequence shows Van Damme blocking his opponent's knife attacks with his own blade in exactly the same way multiple times, with the same facial expressions, body positions, and even the same lighting conditions appearing in each repetition. The decision to reuse footage this way was likely driven by budget constraints and scheduling pressures that prevented the filmmakers from shooting enough original material to fill out the entire fight scene. Choreographing and filming martial arts sequences is expensive and time-consuming, requiring multiple camera angles, safety precautions, and numerous takes to capture all the necessary shots. Rather than spend additional time and money creating new footage, the editors simply looped existing material to extend the length of the fight. This wasn't an isolated incident in Timecop, as other action sequences in the movie also feature repeated footage, including some of Gloria Reuben's fight moves and certain punching combinations during the rainy finale. The practice was actually fairly common in low-budget action movies of the 1980s and 90s, when digital effects weren't available to enhance fight scenes, and filmmakers had to rely on practical techniques to make their action sequences look more elaborate than their budgets allowed. Van Damme's earlier films like Bloodsport also featured repeated footage, particularly during tournament fight scenes where the same kicks and punches would appear multiple times with different opponents. Fact 10. House explosion paradox goes unexplained. One of the most glaring plot holes in Timecop involves the mysterious fate of Max and Melissa Walker's family home, which creates a logical impossibility that the movie never bothers to address or explain. During the climactic sequence set in 1994, the Walker house is completely destroyed by a massive explosion that reduces the entire structure to rubble and flames, yet when Max returns to the present day in 2004, the same house somehow stands perfectly intact and appears to have aged naturally over the intervening 10 years. The explosion sequence shows the house being obliterated by a bomb that Senator McComb planted, with the entire building consumed by fire and collapsing completely. Max carries the wounded Melissa away from the burning wreckage, and the scene clearly establishes that nothing remains of their home except smoking debris. According to the movie's own time travel rules, this destruction should have created a permanent change to the timeline that would affect everything that happened afterward. However, when Max successfully prevents McComb's schemes and returns to his corrected present-day timeline, he finds his house not only rebuilt but looking exactly as it did before, complete with the same architectural details and landscaping. The house appears to have aged naturally over the 10-year period, showing appropriate wear and weathering that suggests it was never destroyed at all. The movie presents this as a happy ending where Max is reunited with his family in their restored home, but it completely ignores the logical contradiction of how the house could exist in its original form. Various fan theories have attempted to explain this inconsistency, with some suggesting that preventing McComb's death somehow erased the timeline where the bomb was planted, while others argue that Melissa must have rebuilt the house to match the original design. However, the movie itself offers no explanation for this paradox, and the dialogue makes no reference to reconstruction or timeline changes that would account for the house's impossible restoration. This plot hole represents one of the most obvious examples of the screenwriters prioritizing a satisfying emotional conclusion over logical consistency, choosing to give Max his happy ending regardless of whether it made sense within the established rules of their time travel story. Fact 11. Y'all. Used incorrectly by Confederate soldier. During Timecop's opening sequence set in 1863, when Confederate soldiers are transporting gold bullion and encounter a mysterious time traveler, one of the soldiers makes a linguistic error that reveals the screenwriter's unfamiliarity with authentic Southern dialect. The Confederate soldier repeatedly uses the word y'all when speaking directly to the single time traveler, treating it as if it were a formal way to address one person, which represents a fundamental misunderstanding of how this distinctly Southern term actually works. The word y'all is a contraction of you all, and has always functioned as an exclusively plural pronoun in Southern American English, used only when addressing two or more people. No genuine Southerner, whether from the 1800s or today, would ever use y'all when speaking to just one person, since the entire purpose of the word is to distinguish between singular you and plural you all. When Southerners want to address a single person formally or respectfully, they use words like sir, ma'am, or simply you, but never y'all. This mistake becomes particularly noticeable because the soldier uses y'all multiple times while speaking directly to the lone time traveler, creating dialogue that would sound completely wrong to anyone familiar with Southern speech patterns. The error suggests that the screenwriters understood y'all was associated with Southern dialect, but didn't grasp its actual grammatical function, instead treating it as a general marker of politeness or formality that could be applied in any situation. The linguistic error is made worse by the fact that the scene is supposed to establish the historical authenticity of the time travel premise, showing that someone from the future has interfered with past events. Having the Confederate soldiers speak in an obviously inauthentic way undermines the credibility of the sequence and makes it harder for audiences to accept that they're watching a genuine historical moment. This type of dialect mistake was fairly common in Hollywood productions of the 1990s, when screenwriters often relied on stereotypical assumptions about regional speech patterns, rather than consulting with dialect coaches or conducting proper research into historical language usage. Fact 12. Max's Wolverine boot brand reference. The costume designers for Timecop created a subtle but deliberate connection to Marvel Comics by having Max Walker wear Wolverine brand work boots throughout the movie, while also styling Van Damme's hair to resemble the famous X-Men character of the same name. This double reference to Wolverine was not a coincidence, but rather an intentional design choice that linked the film's protagonist to one of comic books' most popular and recognizable characters. Max Walker's hairstyle in Timecop features the distinctive swept-back look with pointed sides that closely mirrors Wolverine's iconic hair design from the X-Men comics. The costume department deliberately chose this styling to give Van Damme's character a more rugged, animalistic appearance that would emphasize his role as a tough law enforcement officer who operates outside normal boundaries. The hair design also helped establish Max as someone who shared Wolverine's lone wolf personality and willingness to bend rules when necessary to achieve justice. The Wolverine brand boots that Max wears both on and off duty in the movie were another layer of this comic book reference. Wolverine is a well-known American footwear company that specializes in work boots and outdoor gear, making their products a logical choice for a character like Max Walker who needs durable, practical footwear for his dangerous job. However, the decision to specifically choose this brand name created an additional connection to the Marvel character, especially when combined with the similar hairstyle. This type of subtle pop culture reference was becoming more common in action movies of the 1990s as filmmakers began incorporating small nods to comic books and other media that would be appreciated by fans without being obvious to general audiences. The Wolverine references in Timecop worked particularly well because both characters shared similar traits like being tough, solitary fighters who operated by their own moral codes. The connection also made sense within the context of a movie based on a comic book, since it showed that the filmmakers understood and respected the comic book medium that had inspired their story. Fact 13. Australian censorship cut sex and violence. When Timecop was released in Australia, the film underwent significant censorship to receive a more commercially viable M rating that would allow it to reach a broader audience in theaters. The Australian Censorship Board made 2 major cuts to the original version, removing content they considered too explicit for the rating category that Universal Pictures was targeting for the film's theatrical release. The first major cut involved the intimate scene between Jean-Claude Van Damme and Mia Sara, where Max and Melissa Walker share a romantic moment in their bedroom. The Australian censors trimmed portions of this sequence, reducing the length and intensity of the scene to make it less sexually explicit. This editing was done to ensure that the movie would meet the content guidelines for an M rating, which was considered the ideal classification for action movies targeting teenage and adult audiences without restricting access for younger viewers. The second significant change involved a violent confrontation between Van Damme's character and one of Senator Macomb's henchmen during the film's climactic sequences. In the original version, this scene featured Van Damme repeatedly striking the villain with his pistol in an extended and brutal pistol-whipping sequence that the censors deemed too graphic for the desired rating. The Australian version reduced this prolonged beating to just a single hit, dramatically shortening the violence and making it less intense for viewers. These censorship decisions reflected Australia's stricter approach to movie ratings during the 1990s, when the country's film classification system was more conservative about both sexual content and graphic violence than many other international markets. The cuts were specifically designed to achieve the M rating, which allowed theaters to admit viewers under 17 with parental guidance, rather than receiving the more restrictive MA rating that would have limited the film's potential audience and box office performance. Universal Pictures agreed to these edits because the Australian market was an important source of international revenue for Hollywood action films, and achieving the right rating classification was crucial for maximizing ticket sales. The censored version was what most Australian audiences saw during the film's original theatrical run, though uncut versions later became available through home video releases. Fact 14. 1994 Nissans, called New 1994 Models, in October. During a crucial scene where Max and Melissa Walker meet at a shopping mall, the movie's attention to period detail breaks down in a way that reveals the filmmaker's unfamiliarity with how the automotive industry actually operates. The scene, which is specifically set in October 1994 according to the movie's timeline, features a prominent Nissan display advertising new 1994 models, but this timing creates an obvious error that anyone familiar with car dealerships would immediately notice. The automotive industry follows a well-established annual cycle where new model year vehicles are typically introduced in the fall of the previous calendar year meaning that 1995 model cars would have been arriving at dealerships throughout September and October of 1994. By October of any given year, car manufacturers and dealers are focused on promoting their newest models and clearing out the previous year's inventory through sales and discounts, not advertising old models as if they were still new and exciting. This means that in October 1994, Nissan dealerships would have been showcasing their 1995 model lineup and trying to sell remaining 1994 models at reduced prices to make room for the newer cars. The idea that a major car manufacturer would be prominently advertising new 1994 models during this time period goes against standard industry practices that have been consistent for decades. The error suggests that the movie's production designers were thinking about the scene in terms of the calendar year rather than understanding how model years work in the car business. They apparently assumed that since the story was set in 1994, it would make sense to show 1994 model cars being advertised, without realizing that the specific month mentioned in the script would make this timing completely wrong. This type of mistake reflects the challenges that filmmakers face when trying to recreate specific time periods accurately, especially when dealing with industries that have their own specialized schedules and conventions. The error is particularly noticeable because car model years are such a familiar concept to most audiences, making it the kind of detail that breaks the illusion of authenticity for viewers who notice the inconsistency. Fact 15. Time travel rules completely contradict themselves. The most fundamental logical flaw in Timecop involves the movie's own explanation of how time travel works, which creates a contradiction so obvious that it undermines the entire premise of the story. Early in the film, when government officials are establishing the rules for the Time Enforcement Commission, they clearly state that travelers cannot journey into the future because the future hasn't happened yet, presenting this as an absolute limitation of the technology that prevents anyone from seeing what lies ahead. This rule is presented as scientific fact during the Senate committee scenes, where officials explain that time travel only works in one direction because you can only visit times that have already occurred in history. The implication is that the future remains unknowable and inaccessible because those events don't exist yet in any form that time travelers could visit. The movie treats this limitation as a crucial plot point that explains why the Time Enforcement Commission can only send agents backward to prevent crimes, rather than forward to see their results. However, the entire plot of Timecop depends on time travelers doing exactly what the movie claims is impossible. Every single time travel mission in the film involves agents going back to the past and then returning to their original present day, which means they are traveling from an earlier time period to a later one. When Max Walker travels from 2004 back to 1994 and then returns to 2004, he is technically traveling into the future relative to his position in 1994. The movie never acknowledges this contradiction or attempts to explain how agents can return to their present if forward time travel is supposed to be impossible. The characters routinely travel from past to present using small devices they wear on their wrists, treating this as a simple and routine process that requires no special explanation. This means that the fundamental rule about future travel being impossible is violated in literally every time travel sequence in the movie. The contradiction becomes even more problematic when characters travel back to the past and find that their present has changed, requiring them to return to a different version of 2004 than the one they originally left. This type of forward travel to an altered timeline should be completely impossible according to the movie's own stated rules.